Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the Arctic Resilience Report at the Sustainable Development Working Group meeting. I've been asked to provide a little bit of an update, but I figure I start with what resilience is, because it is a concept that not everyone is familiar with. And it really starts with the idea that there are limits to how much a system can be changed and still recover. And when it moves beyond those limits, something happens. It functions completely differently. The system changes to another state. And resilience is really about the ability to cope with shocks and at the same time preserve the main functions in the system. So that is kind of a basic starting point. And the reason resilience is very relevant in the Arctic today is, of course, because of the very extreme rapid changes that we are observing in the Arctic today. Just one example is the sea ice, but there are a multitude of other examples. And also that there is a need for a more integrated view of the biophysical changes and the social changes, the changes brought on by the rapid industrialization and the global markets and other social changes. One can't look at them as separate changes. They are interrelated, and we need to find ways of understanding how they link to each other. There's also an increased risk of passing thresholds with large impacts on ecosystem services. And if they have impacts on ecosystem services, they will affect societies and human well-being. So in essence, we need to learn to live with change. And there's a need for a more proactive and adaptive decision-making that takes change into account and takes also many different perspectives of change into account. And that's why resilience is so relevant in the Arctic today. The goals of the Arctic Resilience Report is really to identify the potential or risk for shocks and large shifts in ecosystem services that affect human well-being. Then to analyze how different drivers of change interact and affect society's ability to withstand shocks. And thirdly, to evaluate the strategies for adaptation and transformation. In some cases, society will need to adapt to changes. In other cases, adaptation will not be sufficient, or maybe not what we want to do. There's a need for a transformational change into a more sustainable pathway. And the purpose then of assessing resilience is to prepare for change and also avoid shocks or prepare for shocks as well. Some shocks definitely we want to avoid and be able to see them ahead of time before they are there. The Arctic Resilience Report process as a project is to start with a review of available knowledge, which will result in an interim report to be presented in May 2013 in connection with the Kiruna Ministerial of the Arctic Council. It is divided in 3 parts. The first is a methods part, and as I will get back to later, that is not self-evident how to go about this. The second one, we look at the thresholds, the potential thresholds and risks. And a third one will look at what we know about adaptive and transformative capacity, where there is a fair amount of new research coming out, not least from the International Polar Year efforts. We work with workshops to foster interaction and engagement, because this is the type of assessment that can't only rely on knowledge that's in literature. It needs to be a dialogue of different types of knowledges and different perspectives, and also in relation to practice. We work with case studies, which I will get back to a little bit. We will then try to do a synthesis and integration, which will then result in a final report at the end of the Canadian chairmanship in May of 2015. We also have a small component on capacity building in the project. And this slide kind of shows the overview of the methodology. It really is a matter of starting resilience of what? What is it that you're concerned with? And this can range from a large system, like a large marine ecosystem or something like that, to a very small local subsistence system. It's a social choice we make of what we want to assess. We need to look at what are the changes, drivers of change that affect that. Resilience to what? What are the potential shocks? And here we come into the third circle, which the potential thresholds, what are they? What are the risks that actually the system might pass a threshold, which is what the interim report part 2 will deal with. And as I mentioned earlier, the interim report part 3 will address adaptive and transformative capacity. What is it that confers resilience to a society? And I should say here that resilience, although at one level it's a concept about staying within the system, it is increasingly also recognized that we need to understand how systems transform to one state to another in a way that isn't destructive to society. We will rely here, of course, on the knowledge that comes from the literature on adaptive capacity and transformative capacity, but we will also rely on input from a Danish-led project, I should say, that called the Arctic Ecosystem Resilience Assessment, that looks specifically at resilience in ecosystem without really taking in so much the social component as we will do. And the resilience assessment process also include looking at what are the policy options, what are ways of maybe decreasing the risk of thresholds, what are ways of increasing capacity for adaptation or transformation. So feeding into a policy process. And this circle, of course, have to probably do more than once, because as you learn about the thresholds, it affects what you might want to think of as resilience of what and to what. So it's really an iterative process. But there are, as I mentioned, some method challenges. It's not a straightforward taking a method, applying and going ahead. And one of the big challenges is to be respectful, find a respectful integration of different types of knowledge or different knowledges. And these are the biophysical and the social analysis, basically the natural science and social sciences, with different assumptions, different methodologies, different theories. How can we integrate in a way that is respectful to both of those knowledge traditions? And we also need to integrate across traditional knowledge and science, because we want to use the best knowledge available. I will not dwell so much on that, but it is an issue we will discuss a lot at a workshop at the end of October in Kautokeino, Norway. Another methodological concern is the balance between pan-Arctic perspectives and more specific perspectives to make it more relevant to decision makers on the ground. And the way we're dealing with that is to have the scientific reviews and the questionnaires to address the more pan-Arctic perspectives, and also later the synthesis, of course, and using case studies to look at more specific issues and cases, which is a more bottom-up approach. And also the way we're engaging case studies is in more bottom-up manner, and I will get back to that as well. Looking a bit more at the biophysical and social perspectives, the way we have kind of very roughly depicted the world, and I want to say very clearly that this is work in progress, is to acknowledge the differences. That the physical world, it can, to the extent that we know the processes, it can be understood in terms of models and interactions. Whereas the human world and the social world also has a component of choice and agency that we have to deal with in terms of understanding how it functions. It can't be captured in the same kind of models as the physical world. So rather than collapsing everything in one, we actually acknowledge that these are different kinds of processes and they have to be approached and understood in different ways. And what we have to do then is look at the linkages. And this is what this picture, rather complex picture, takes a peek at. We talk a lot about social ecological systems. And any social ecological system has physical and ecological components to it. The structure and process and the habitat, it has functions. And the social, on the other hand, also have their parts. You have the food materials that are used, the recreation, you have governance policies, etc. In the middle in this picture, of course all over in reality, we are using the concept of ecosystem services as a way of looking at looking at the connections between them. So how do changes in ecosystems affect ecosystem services that are of value to society, such as the provisioning, regulating, and cultural services that link to food materials and carbon dioxide uptake, or recreational or spiritual values. But also, going in the back loop, what are the governance policies and practices that affect human behavior individually and collectively that have impacts on the landscapes and seascapes, and feeding back to the basic structure. Each of these parts of this picture can be studied by different methods, and we need to do both, and we need to acknowledge that there are different approaches to understanding them. We also have to pay attention to the spatial scale, where any social ecological system you choose, you have to look at the scales above and the scales below. And also the scale in time. What we've done in the past affects us now. What we do now will affect us in the future. So having those dimensions. And lastly, but not least, the drivers that come from outside the system. There's an internal dynamic, but there are also drivers on the social system, say markets, ideas, values, and you have drivers acting on the physical system, such as climate change. So capturing all of this in some way, and it's not, we won't be able to capture all of it, but we want to capture the interaction and how they might affect the system as a whole. Translating then this to the interim report of the Arctic Resilience Report is that we have a chapter on thresholds that will look at geophysical, ecological thresholds, the interactions between those, and what impacts they will have on ecosystem services. You can see it as a three-dimensional space where we have to look at the marine, coastal, and terrestrial for each ecosystem service, and at several different scales. We will then also attempt looking at some of the social thresholds, but not in the same way. We will do a critical reflection on what thresholds might mean in the social systems. And last, we will have a first attempt at identifying the links across these social and natural domains, are the cascading or dampening feedbacks. And then the third part of the report, as I mentioned earlier, we look at the adaptive and transformative capacities, such as social learning, social capital, learning, etc. The case studies, as I mentioned briefly earlier, are examples of social ecological systems. What can we learn about the Arctic resilience in general from such cases? We have a couple of pilot case studies, reindeer herding in Scandinavia, food security, shipping in the Bering Strait, changing wildlife and subsistence systems in the southwest Yukon. In the next round, we're looking at adding more cases. There have been discussions about an urban case study, maybe one looking at marine biota, and we very much would like to invite ideas about further case studies that would be interesting and where there is other research to build on. I should just say one or two words about capacity building because I feel it's an important part of the project. We are starting to develop a course on Arctic resilience in collaboration with the University of the Arctic. We will also work on developing and evaluating the resilience assessment methodology in an Arctic context, with the possibility of later creating an Arctic resilience assessment workbook. There is a resilience assessment workbook that we use as a basis for our work, but it needs to be improved and developed in relation to Arctic realities. And this, next to last slide, is just to put everything in context in terms of time. We have at the bottom of the slide the different parts that I've been talking about, and at the top of the slide some other Arctic Council and other processes. And in relation to the Sustainable Development Working Group, of course, the Arctic Human Development Report, where we hope that the work carried out there will feed into the second phase of our assessment. We have the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment that's being completed in May, and the Ecosystem-Based Management Expert Group. Their understanding and knowledge should, of course, feed into the Arctic Resilience Report. We will also, or should also, have an exchange with the Adaptation Action for a Changing Arctic a new initiative that remains to be developed. And as I mentioned very briefly, the Arctic Ecosystem Resilience Assessment that's going on as a Danish-led initiative, not within the Arctic Council, but funded with the Nordic Council of Ministers partly. Those kinds of knowledges we need to feed in, and those kinds of processes we need to link to in the Arctic Resilience Report. And without them, we wouldn't be able to do the work we're doing. So that is one of my messages to you, is to look at then at how do we make these links between the different processes within the Arctic Council and other projects as good and as useful as possible. And with that, I would like to say thank you. And we do put our material up on a website where it should be easy to download. So please visit. Thank you.